So I've always felt like they don't really know who I am, the full me, because they don't know about my dad. What happened to my dad is so much of who I am today that it's shaped me. So if they don't know that about me, then they don't really know me. So now with the podcast, sharing the story, talking with other people, sharing their stories, like I feel like I can finally just be one person. I don't have to be this person with the secret and then the other person that I show the world. Now I can just be one person, show the world everything, and it's so much better and easier to be one person. Welcome back to episode 8 of Kids of Overdose. I'm your host, Candice, and this is part 1 of a 2-part episode series. We are doing things a little different this go around. Instead of me interviewing someone about their experience, I will be the one being interviewed by my life coach / therapist, Brian Nandy from BN Counseling. It felt totally different being on the other side of the microphone. Coming out of this, I think I understand why so many people would be hesitant in telling their story, just because I found it really hard to get all of my thoughts and all of the facts out in a way to explain it to people who have no idea about any of it or anything about me. It was hard because all of these thoughts have lived in my head for so long, and I understand all of it, and I've never had to actually explain it before. So it was hard. But just know that if you do want to try talking about it and sharing your story, that I would be completely patient and flexible with you. If you mess up, we could start over. Like, it means just as much to me as it does to you to share your authentic story, because I'm so interested, and I know other people are too. But besides that, I've poured out all of my hidden secrets and my heart into this interview, and I hope you won't judge me or my dad. Thanks again for listening to Kids of Overdose.
Which parent of yours did you lose to overdose? How old were you? And if you remember, how did it happen?
I lost my dad to a drug overdose. He was 25 years old at the time. I was 5. On March 15th, 1991, I believe it was a couple days before St. Patrick's Day. And he had just taken his physical exam to enlist for another 4 years for the Coast Guard. He was in the Coast
Mm.
Guard previously, and after he finished his 4 years, he kind of didn't really want to go back right away. And then after a couple years, he decided, I'm just going to go back, because he couldn't figure out what other career or things to do with his life. So he took his test and he passed the physical with flying colors. He was always a guy who liked to eat healthy and work out. He was very buff. A lot of
Mm.
people say that about him. He was just a very good looking, strong guy. So he did great at his physical. And my grandpa told me this once. When my grandpa was picking my dad up from the physical, and as he was driving on the highway, all of a sudden he got this weird thought in his head. And the thought said, Louie's dead. And my grandpa like had to snap himself out of it. Like, what? What is that? Louie's not dead. And he just thought it was so weird. So My grandpa picked my dad up. They went back to my grandma and grandpa's house, and it was going to be St. Patty's Day. And my grandma makes such good corned beef and cabbage. And she made my dad a corned beef sandwich, homemade. And that would be the last meal he ever had, was a homemade corned beef sandwich from his mom. And I've had her homemade corned beef, and I can tell you it is so good. So I'm happy that he got to have a really good meal. After that, he wanted to go meet up with some friends at a bar to celebrate that he was going back into the Coast Guard and he was going to have a new start and kind of like a little bit of like a going away party. My grandpa said, "Take the car." And my dad said, "No, I'm going to take a cab because I'm going to be drinking and I don't want to get a DUI." So my dad took a cab to Jersey City, where he had grew up and where he was from, and went to like a neighborhood bar that he used to go to a lot. That night, it was after midnight. My grandparents got a phone call at their house. My uncle, my dad's brother, was living there at the time, and my uncle answered the phone, and it was the middle of the night, and my uncle said he was pretty out of it. He just woke up, and there was a woman on the other end of the phone, a woman that was from the old neighborhood that they used to live at. And she said, "Joe, you have to come here. Your brother, something's wrong with your brother." And my Uncle Joey said that at first he thought, "Oh, what? Like, is he drunk? Like, what's the big deal? Just, whatever, send him home." And she was just like, "No, you need to come here and you need to come here right now." And so my uncle got off the phone. He told my grandparents, like, "We have to go. Something's wrong with Louis." And they got into the car and they drove to the street that they needed to go. And my uncle said there was fire trucks and ambulances and all these emergency vehicles all on the street. And they were like, "Oh my God, what the hell is going on?" They thought maybe there was a fire or something. So then they go up to see where my dad was. And my uncle, I think he went in the house and it was in the basement of someone's house. And my dad was there and they could not revive him. He had died of an overdose.
It sounded like with your uncle, he didn't think much of it, so it must have been out of character as well.
Yes, they were very shocked. I think they never would have ever imagined that something like this could happen.
Especially since he had been preparing actively in his enrollment. So it just was so out of character. And there still isn't. Uh, do you know? Is there any clarification as to what happened to him?
I didn't find out he died of a drug overdose until I was 16 years old. So from when I was 5 years old to 16, my family told me that he died of a heart attack. And now that I look back, I know it's because they were trying to protect me and they didn't know how to tell me and they didn't want to do the wrong thing. And so they thought that by telling me he had a heart attack was the best thing for me. And then when I turned 16, I was in a car one night with my grandpa, my dad's dad. He pulled over on the side of the road and he told me that he had to tell me something. My grandpa said that my dad was going out with his friends to celebrate that he passed his physical and that he was re-enlisting and going away to Coast Guard. And that he went to a friend's house and they were going to have a couple drinks before they went to the bar. As his friend went to take a shower, my dad poured a glass of orange juice and vodka. Unbeknownst to my dad, the friend was a recovering heroin addict and was on methadone and would store his methadone in his orange juice. And so when my dad poured himself vodka and orange juice, he ended up drinking methadone with it. And my grandpa said That's what he died from. A drug overdose, an accidental drug overdose from drinking methadone. And it was just completely 100% accidental, freak accident. So it sounded like a movie to me. It was crazy. And I'm like, what? Like, I don't know. It was wild. So then, that was I found that out in my teenage years, and then that was around the time when I started experimenting with things and drinking and going out, and so knowing that about my dad, I just kinda I don't know, it messed me up a little bit, and it was something I was embarrassed that I didn't wanna tell people because I just
Mm,
thought it was so s different. Like, I didn't know
mm,
anybody else that happened to their parent. I don't know, it was just I didn't know how to, like, handle it. So I just didn't really talk about it. I thought about
mhm,
it all the time, but
mhm.
never talked about it. And
Was
then
it a
mhm.
sorry, could I ask, was it a shock to get this different or true story of what had happened?
Well, I always was suspicious of them saying he had a heart attack. I always knew there had to have been something else because he was so healthy. Like it didn't make sense. He was young and healthy. They never talked about a heart condition or they never even said like, "Oh, how odd is it that he had a heart attack at so young?" Like it was just something nobody ever talked about. So I just felt I always knew like just something didn't seem right. It must have been something else, but I just didn't know what it was. So
I see.
I guess I was half surprised. And then as I got older in my 20s, my grandma has this big trunk in her house and it has a lot of my dad's documents.
Mm,
And she was like, "Oh, do you want to have this box? There's a lot of paperwork in here that I've been saving and I can give it to you." Well, there was a lot of stuff in the box. So it took me a couple days to slowly sort through things. And in the box was an envelope and inside was a autopsy report.
mm,
And the autopsy report was my dad's autopsy report and it said what was in his system, and it had cocaine and methadone.
mm,
So then I'm like, okay, he also had cocaine. And then I'm like, all right, he was, then it was like a new thing to process. It wasn't just that he accidentally drank methadone, but he was
mm.
also doing cocaine. And so then it seemed a little less innocent. Then it was like, oh my God, was this his fault? I don't know,
Mm,
it just brings up so many more questions, and then that was the story, that the autopsy had cocaine and methadone, and so then I went on with my life thinking that trying to understand, whatever. And then a couple years ago, my grandpa died, and after my grandpa died, one of my dad's old friends that I had never talked to before connected with me on Facebook,
mm,
and I had always wanted to connect with my dad's old friends. I always wanted to hear stories about my dad because I've heard so many stories from my family, but then after a while, that's it. There's nothing new. So like I wanted to hear more about him. So his friend offered to get go on the phone with me to tell me stories or whatever, and I was like, "Oh, that's so great." I was so excited. And so I went on the phone with him and it was not what I expected, and I don't hate this guy or anything, but it just wasn't what I expected, and I don't think he meant any harm, but
about.
he said that so my dad had a best friend, Georgie,
Mm,
and Georgie got hit by a train a year
oh,
before my dad died. My dad grew up with him. They were best friends their entire life, like, since they were little kids. They grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools, just always like so close. And so I know my dad took it pretty hard.
Yeah,
So this was the younger brother of his best friend.
I
And
see.
he said that my dad all of a sudden out of nowhere would just start showing up at his house and seeing if he wanted to hang out. And so they would go to a bar or they would go to a baseball game or they would like do sports stuff because that's what this guy enjoyed doing. My dad really wasn't into sports, so he would just watch. But either way, he would tag
Mhm.
along. I guess my dad was tagging along with him a lot. And he said it was fun. Sometimes they would just sit in his kitchen and listen to the radio and have some beers and talk and laugh and joke and they would just hang out. So one day my dad showed up at his house and was like, "Hey, I want to take you somewhere." The guy's like, "Okay." And then my dad's like, "You're going to drive. I'll tell you where to drive. But I want to show you something." So they get in the car, and my dad tells him, "You probably think it's weird that I keep just randomly showing up at your house, but I come here because you're so different than everyone else I know. And it's good for me to be around you instead of the other people that I know because I'm trying to get clean for my daughter." And then the friend was like, "What? What are you talking about?" Like, I think he even said, like, he laughed. He was like, "You're not a drug addict. What are you talking about?" So then my dad was like, "Okay, I'll tell you where to drive. I need you to drive on this road and turn right here and turn left there and turn right here." And then the guy said that they ended up in somewhere in New York and they drove underneath like a bridge. And under the bridge was like this small little like shack next to a little
Mhm.
shack looking bar.
Mhm.
And my dad's was like, "Okay, pull over here." And my dad pointed to the like shack looking building and he said, "That's where I used to that's where I used to do heroin." And something like, and now I'm trying to get clean and I don't do that anymore. The guy was really shocked. He said he had no idea. And then there was a little bar next to the shack. So my dad said, "Oh, let's go in this bar." They went into the bar, and the guy said that inside there were all these like seedy, weird looking people. People looked like really like rough around the edges. Like he said that he was uncomfortable. He didn't really want to be there. It's not like a nice place at all. And that my dad knew everyone and everybody knew my dad. And my dad's like, "Hey, come on, let's have a drink or whatever. Let's have a drink here." And the guy was like, "Nah, I don't really want to have a drink here." So they ended up
Mhm.
leaving after a little bit. And I told that guy, I said, "Well, my dad didn't die of heroin. My dad died of cocaine." And then the guy
Mhm.
said, "Oh my God, I just assumed he went back to it. I assumed he did heroin." And I was like, "No, he was on methadone and nobody knew where the methadone was from. And I guess all this time it was my dad's methadone. It wasn't the guy it was my dad's. That's why it was in his system because he was taking it." And he didn't have any heroin on the autopsy report. So I got off the phone with that guy, whatever, thanks for sharing the story with me. I was so freaked out. I was really messed up for a few days, like really bad. But then I processed it, and I went through different emotions. I'm proud of my dad that he did get clean for me. He'd stopped doing heroin. He made a mistake and he was celebrating and he did cocaine, which is bad too.
It's so with not having enough information and your desire to get to know him, what people share, we take it in because we're trying to make sense of this man who was strong but vulnerable as well as we all are. And because so little was shared about him, the information in the discovery or wanting to know who he was, the information that were provided of you were all surrounded around this drug associated information versus how did he live? What were his joys? What were his passions? What
Yeah,
made him smile?
like, so it was finally only up until a couple years ago that I finally was able to put all the pieces together and kind of mostly know the as much of this whole story as I can, right? Because I wasn't there, but at least
Mm-hmm.
I've now been able to put a lot of the pieces to the puzzle together. Those few days when I first found out, I went through a lot of different emotions. One of the things, I was so sad for him because I love him so much that I would never want him to be sad or to be going through anything. And I cried so much thinking he must have been so lost. He was like a lost soul. And he didn't have anybody that could help get him out of it. And I wish I could have helped him.
Yeah.
Like like as a mother, because I'm a mom now. So it just makes me think of my kids, and I would be heartbroken if they were ever so lost. And I just
Yeah.
was so sad for him because on the outside, I guess he didn't look really lost because everybody always says all these great things about him. But I think part of him being a little lost, I think things weren't picture perfect beneath the surface. And I think there were just things he struggled with internally, and maybe he didn't talk about it. My mom always would say that he was very quiet.
So he must have been an introvert. I wonder, a person has a very rich internal world, and often, especially if it's a male introvert, they and their depth may not be understood by those around them. I can't help but think about your dad's best friends dying, the traumatic grief that must have impacted him.
I heard a story. Somebody was telling me about like how my dad was. Like when he was a kid growing up, he'd always be hanging out at the schoolyard and kids would be playing stickball. But my dad wasn't the one playing the game. He would be the one with the kids sitting on the side, sneaking beer cans in their book bag. And they would be watching and having fun, but they weren't the ones playing the game. And that was like the way that they described my dad. Like he would be out, but he would steal beers out of my grandparents' fridge, and and I did the same thing. When I was a kid, I was with those kids too. I wasn't playing the sport, but I was hanging out at the park and maybe in the bleachers. I can kind of understand that in a way. So he's always been kind of maybe adventurous in that kind of way since he's a kid. And I'm sure as he got older, it expanded into more and more things. And I think that the friends that he was hanging out with were doing a lot of those things. And when you're in that group of people, and maybe that's why he wanted so much to hang out with this other guy, because it was helping to keep him away from that because he was trying to make changes.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that because the story can be so skewed about the tragedy, but his legacy and the essence of all that was good, gifted, and sacred about him has to be honored as well. And sometimes we don't hear about that, those parts. It sounds like he was an observer, he still participated.
Yeah.
Teenagers in their risk taking, this mischievousness, there's curiosity, there's, identity formation
And
to
having no
conform or not.
fear. One of my aunts says that if there was one word to describe him, he was fearless. He had no fear. He was not afraid of anything or anyone. And
Wow.
that probably didn't help.
Yeah, right. Every character trait we have, it can be our strength and our weakness.
Yes. And he's my hero. I think of
Mm.
him literally every single day. All my life, I've kept this like a secret. I feel like I live two lives. I have the one where people know about my dad and what really happened, which is a very just a few people, and then the rest of the world, coworkers and f- lots of other friends and whoever, just people that I interact with, they don't know. So I've always felt like they don't really know who I am, the full me, because they don't know about my dad. And because what happened to my dad is so much of who I am today, and it's shaped me. So if they don't know that about me, then they don't really know me. So now with the podcast, sharing the story, talking with other people sharing their stories, like I feel like I can finally just be one person. I don't have to be this person
Mm.
with the secret and then the other person that I show the world. Now I can just be one person, show the world everything, and it's so much better and easier to be one person.
That is simply inspiring. Perhaps that's what you have been able to do, which your dad wasn't able to. Sounds like he too had a dual life. One which people knew him as fearless and courageous, an observer, and another version of him who had struggles,
Yeah.
and he could not share those parts of him.
Yeah, and one thing that I think about is it sucks because he died back in 1991. And you could Google him and you won't find anything. Like you won't find anything, not even his obituary. When people died that long ago, there's nothing on the internet. But today, if someone dies, you Google, you see their Facebook and their LinkedIn and their obituary and all these things. So it's like they exist. But it's almost like my dad never existed because if you look him up, he's not there. It hurts me because he's so important to me that I want him to exist everywhere because I think he's so special. And so,
And you get to do this with your podcast.
yes,
His life, his memory.
yes. So this is a way that he can still exist, gone but not forgotten. And even if it's just to a handful of listeners, it kind
I
of
think your podcast allows, sorry to have interrupted you,
yeah, yeah.
but I'm wondering also, your podcast also gives to the other speakers, so other individuals who've had that story that their parents and those whom they've lost also now get to exist in the Ethernet
Yeah, and I'm so
to be
grateful for the
known.
people that will share their stories with me because it's so hard to find people that are willing to do it. And sometimes like if I when I tell people about the podcast, like, oh, Kids of Overdose podcast, I interview people who've lost a parent to overdose. Like the first thing that these people like the look on their face is like, oh my God. Like, oh, that sounds really sad and ooh. But like for me, it's not. It's so healing. It doesn't make me sad. It feels like someone's holding my hand, that I'm not alone. And look, they went through it too. And maybe their experience is a little different, but we have something in common. And it's something that so many people are shameful and there's so much stigma around it. And when we share the story and we listen to each other, it's like the shame is gone and it just feels really good. I don't think these conversations are sad. I think they're uplifting and they're healing. And I don't know every way to describe it, but I know that it's just something that feels good.
Speaking about death and dying and grief requires a certain amount of courage. And we live in a very anxiety provoking world. We also live in a world where people are afraid to connect and be vulnerable and be authentic, even though there's much conversation about it. I wonder, for those individuals who react differently, react from a place like, oh, that's so deep or so dark, what their stories are. But to those who, like you, your conversation about grief and loss is on the spectrum of love, but it's that loss of love, that gift of love, you know, spoken, shared from a place of loss. Like you said, gone but not forgotten.
Yeah, I like that. It doesn't come from a place of sadness, it comes from a place of love. Yeah.
Love, right?
Mhm.
Right? And memory and legacy and appreciation. So much of who we are is made up of our ancestors who may not have names anymore, but we are in that lineage of people who survived and thrived, and now we have a life of resiliency. And we all have the opportunity to take our struggles and to turn them around. The things that cause us anxiety becomes the opportunity for growth. What may have shaken us could be what empowers us, and that's what you've done. And you don't have to be rah rah, you know, about it. You can be tender and strong at the same time.
Hmm.
And that's what you're doing with your podcast, in my opinion. Listening to the previous individuals, they speak with such pride when they speak about the parent whom they've lost.
And not
There's a deeper
everybody,
appreciation.
yeah. And not everybody has a pride for the parent they lost, which is
Mm,
something that's been interesting and new for me to discover as well. Some people lost a parent to overdose, but that parent was also maybe not a very good parent,
mm.
but the child still suffers. They suffer the parent while the parent was alive, and they suffer after the parent dies because any trauma that's passed down, it's there.
Are we using our life experiences as an opportunity to reflect and improve, evolve, align? That becomes our purpose. Often what we consider a purpose-driven life, we associate it to a vocation. But a vocation it isn't necessarily our purpose. It is the space we get to practice becoming more of. Our purpose could be essentially our undoing, our mistakes, our regrets, our shame,
What do you mean by undoing?
undoing the things that we are embarrassed about, shameful about, anxious about.
So So it undoes the things that are holding us back.
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially, we are using the devil to serve God. We are using our traumas to serve our evolution. You know, like the rocket, right? The propulsion, the very negative energy of the propulsion of the fire and allows for the rocket to move upward using
Mm.
negative energy to create positive energy direction. That's sort of what we've got to think about our suffering. Do we use our suffering as a way to discover what worked, what did not work? How would I prefer to be? Or do we create an attachment to that suffering and romanticize it?
Maybe we do both.
Yes. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. Some do too much of the romanticizing and they stay stuck in that cycle.
I think
And
maybe I
others,
romanticized when I was younger, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's often the first stage of life. First stage of life, about all our mistakes, our experiments, what worked, because our first stage of life as well, 35 and under, informs us of our character strengths. Evidence of what's been working, whether we're good at homework, whether we're good friends. Those aspects of us happen, coexist with the parts of us that didn't work out and the mistakes we made. Your dad was in his first stage of life.
Yeah.
But you see, whatever his issues were with addiction, we all have that, let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. A lot of us were just luckier to not have overdosed or been hit by a car, whatever. But you changed the story. I loved how you said you were constantly thinking about it, but you didn't have a chance to talk about it. And I wonder, your dad, as an observer, the little bit that you've told me about him, spoken here, that's the function of introverts. They are observers first before they participate with the larger crowd, and they prefer small crowds and can be very family-like. Um, but their thoughts are deep, and they may not have they may not have anyone to talk to because essentially they may have one person to speak to. And if your dad, and this is me making up a story as well, but I'd like to think that that fearless, introverted young man, hmm, who was on his way to a vocation to protect his country, to want to be a better person, he needed time to think about what was it that meant something to him. When we think about midlife crisis, so many individuals, they may have gone to college, they may have a job, a career, and then once they get to that 35 to 45 period, and they find themselves feeling lost. Metanoia, the necessary falling apart. So I've done all these things. What's next? What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to become?
Mhm.
He may have had those questions. And those questions, they may sound simple once we've discovered them, but they are quite an enigma.
I think he had a lot of pressure too, because I
Mm,
was young. He tried different careers because he didn't really like the Coast Guard. I heard that he didn't like the politics and the rankings and all that. He didn't think that some
mm,
people deserve to be told what to do and others to tell people what to do. He didn't like that, like the authority part. So then he was doing cement laying after the Coast Guard, and I heard that he had some other major drug issues when he was doing that in Long Island City. So he left that, and then he was a car mechanic, and then he was a taxi cab driver, and it just nothing was
oh,
sticking.
he was searching. Right. Yes, he
Yeah.
was searching. He was just. I think it's also important to know, and maybe it means something or not. People don't just do drugs because um, they just want to have fun. There is that aspect, and then there's a dependency aspect where individuals use it to quiet that inner dialogue or chatter. Some
Mm.
people clean closets, some people sleep, some people have sex, some drink. So we're all finding ways to cope. And it may not attach until we're going through something really difficult and we take that thing or we do that thing and suddenly we are soothed and we feel better. And
Mm.
an attachment happens. It worked. And so the brain has a tendency to keep repeating what works. I think, when you speak about stigma and judgment, our process of decision making to judge, should I make a left, should I make a right, should I have this, should I not? And when a mistake is made in our superego, our critical inner voice, comes the moral judgment. And then shame begins to cause a cancerous effect on the habits of the heart and mind and how one sees oneself.
And that's what goes on inside the user's mind.
And they may need that drug now to quiet their critical voice, their shaming voice, their blaming voice, the bully within, the critic within.
Just hate to think that he ever suffered in that way, even if it was just internally with like what you were just saying.
Yeah, he may have suffered, but it sounds like he also had some really good moments.
Yes.
That's a wrap for part 1. In part 2, we dive into the feelings I went through after learning the truth about my dad and what helped me process this tragedy growing up. And Brian shares some insights from his psychotherapist perspective. Cover art is from Pixabay. Music is by Clavier from Pixabay. This podcast is not sponsored in any way. Thanks again for listening to Kids of Overdose. Take good care.